Part 2, what a third game in this series would have been. Now, to give a short recap of the first part, we went over Sonic and the Black Knight and Sonic and Secret Rings, when they came out, what they're about, and why it was that this series was cancelled to begin with. So now this part is going to be what a third game in this series would have been like. As I mentioned in the first part, SEGA had ran a poll about what the third game in the Storybook Chronicles would have been, giving off certain concepts like haunted houses, the Old West, and how Greek mythology won the poll. But because the series was cancelled, that never really went anywhere. So the big question is, personally, what would I have used as a concept for a third game in the Storybook Chronicles series? Well, it's been an idea that I've had in my mind for a long time. If I was in charge, and if the first two games didn't sell so poorly and actually did well, because, they were made on other consoles besides the dang Wii. Like, seriously, why would you only make 2 games on one console? That's completely limiting the scope of imagination. Anyway, if I was in charge, if I was going to make a third game, it would be Sonic in the Grimm Fairy Tales. Now, before you say anything, I know what you're thinking. The Grimm Fairy Tales? You mean the original German fairy tales that most Disney movies are based off of? The original stories that were super dark and twisted and kind of demented a little bit in some places? Wouldn't that be a little too much to turn into a kid-friendly video game series? Now, you would be right. You would be absolutely right in thinking that. Those fairy tales are dark. They are disturbing. And it might be impossible to make that kid-friendly if it hadn't already been done. I brought up again the Disney movies. Several classic Disney movies. Cinderella, Snow White, Tangled is basically the story of Rapunzel. All of those movies were based off of old fairy tales. These old fairy tales that were originally really dark and disturbing. And Disney somehow managed to make them more kid-friendly. Even though in those films there are still dark moments. Because again, Disney doesn't sugarcoat everything, just downplays it a little bit, but it's still there. And going off of that, there are a lot of Sonic games that have dark subject matter in them. I mean, Sonic Adventure 2 brought up the whole thing with Maria and how she died, which was expanded on in Shadow the Hedgehog, but we don't talk about that. And in Sonic 06, as bad as that game was, it has on-screen death, and death is mentioned. And a lot of other Sonic games have a lot of dark subject matter in them too. Whether they're good games or not, you can't deny that they do have some dark material in them. But they're still marketed as kid-friendly games. Because despite the fact that they do have an audience of older players, like myself, I happen to be an adult and I do like Sonic the Hedgehog games, they are primarily aimed towards kids. And even then, there's still some things in them that are quite dark and a bit intense for kids. But they're still marketed as kids' games nonetheless. So I think this is possible. I think if the series wasn't cancelled, they could have made a third Storybook game with the Grimm Fairy Tales. How would it work, though, you probably asked? Well, the way I see it is something like this. This is the plot I had in mind for the third game. Sonic gets sucked into the world of the Grimm Fairy Tales. The first character he runs into is the Golden Goose. From the story of the Jack and the Beanstalk. The Golden Goose lays golden eggs, Jack tries to get them, and there's a giant or whatever. The first character he runs into is the Golden Goose. Initially, Sonic is confused, like in the other 2 games. He's like, what's going on, where am I, and all that other stuff. The Golden Goose then tells him that an evil entity known as the Storybook writer, I'm using this as a proxy name because I don't have an official name for the main villain of this game. They're trying to make the Grimm Fairy Tales real. In other words, they're trying to take the darker elements and bring them into the real world to turn the world into a living nightmare. Sonic has to then team up with classic characters from these stories. The Golden Goose, Little Red Riding Hood, the goats from the story of the Wolf and the 7 Children, all that. He teams up with those characters and he plays through 8 levels, which is based on the 8 most well-known stories of the Grimm Fairy Tales, collecting items such as the Golden Goose Egg and other things. And with every level he completes, he has to fight a new boss. the big bad wolf, the witch of Hansel and Gretel, the evil queen who tried to kill Snow White, all that stuff. And by the time he gets to the end of the game, he has to fight the entity that's trying to turn the world into a living nightmare by making these dark stories real. At one point he doesn't succeed. There's two phases of this battle. One of them actually just takes place in a cutscene. He almost gets the crap beat out of him, but then a dark force envelops him and he turns into, wait for it, Dark Sonic. Yeah, I wanted to implement that part in the story because that seems like a thing that only ever existed one time in the anime and is never brought up again in any other part of the canon. I think that should actually be implemented in one of these games. He turns dark because of the darkness that surrounds him from these grim dark stories, but it doesn't completely overtake him. He still has his pure heart, and he uses this power to fight the entity and defeat them. When he succeeds, the stories, they still are, as dark and disturbing as they are, but at the very least they're kept contained in the book, and they're not released out into the real world. He meets back up again with the Golden Goose, she thanks him, and then the book closes and the story ends. I don't know whether or not I would have ended it with another after credits scene where Sonic explains what happened. Maybe it would be. Maybe a final cutscene where he's holding the Grim Fairy Tale book in his hand and he decides to just put it on the shelf, leave it there, and just leave. Like, go do something else. And then it zooms in on the book, and then when it says Grim Fairy Tales, it changes to say Sonic and the Grim Fairy Tales. Fade to black, game ends. That's at least what I would have done if I could make a third game in this series. I feel like this series should have gone on past 2 games, because like I said in part 1, there's nothing wrong with them. They seem like pretty good games on a surface level. The stories are good and well paced, the voice acting is pretty good, the characters all get a chance to shine, all that stuff. It's just that, again, making them exclusive to the Wii hurt these games very badly. You can't make a game exclusive to just one console because it limits the scope of imagination. People don't like a certain gaming console. The Wii wasn't really all that popular. I mean, when it came out, it was, but then after a while, people really stopped liking playing with it. It's just really not a fun console to play with, in all honesty. I think nowadays, if they were gonna reboot those 2 series, because they re-released these Sonic Colors, when they made Sonic Colors Ultimate, they basically re-released it, added new things, and then released it for other consoles, including the Nintendo Switch. I figured they could do that now. If Sega really wanted to, they could take Secret Rings and Black Knight and reboot them, remaster them, and re-release them on other consoles, like the Switch, and the Xbox, and the PlayStation. This time actually provide more consoles for these games to be played on. Fine-tune them, make the gameplay a bit better, because that's all that we need to change. The stories themselves are fine. They could stay the same way they are. The stories don't need tweaking or anything, because that's basically what they did with Sonic Colors Ultimate. The story is basically the same. The only thing they changed is the level layout and add more collectibles and whatever. You could do the same thing with Secret Rings and Black Knight. Keep the story the same and all that, but change the gameplay, change all that other stuff. Adapt them so that you could play them on other systems. That way they might do better. And who knows, if they did that and the game sold well this time, they could actually make a third one. But this was all the way back in the early 2010s. I doubt they'll ever get the idea to do that again, but they really should. There are a lot of Sonic games that didn't do very well that they could do with a remake because they don't have bad ideas per se. Because all the bad Sonic games, their problems wasn't... They were bad games, but I think they're not unsalvageable. I think you could fix them. Sonic 06, it doesn't have a bad idea on paper, the whole time travel aspect and all of that stuff. That could work. It just needs more fine-tuning. Shadow the Hedgehog, the morality system, while utterly pointless, I think it could work if you keep in mind that the story itself needs to be fixed a bit. I think maybe if you just had one linear story without a moral system, it could have worked. Sonic Forces, I get what they were trying to do with that one. It's basically a more modern version of the Sonic SatAM cartoon. But there are a lot of issues with that one. So many issues that I think I'll make a separate video going into that one into detail. But still, it's not a bad idea. None of the bad Sonic games had bad ideas. They just had bad executions. Because that's the whole thing. That's how the saying goes. There are no bad ideas, only bad executions. I think those games could have been better if they were just executed properly. And I feel the exact same way with Secret Rings and Black Knight. They're not bad games, they just had bad executions. And if Sega really did care enough, they could go back and fix them and re-release them so people could play them and actually realize that these games are a lot better than they think. I'm Toshi the Panda, and I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.